Welcome to week 2 of the Bible course. We're going to talk today about how we got the Bible. And I just want to begin by saying, newsflash, the Bible was not handed to the original disciples at the Last Supper. It actually came through a process over many years, and the Bible didn't take on the form that we know it as today until about 400 years after Jesus was with us. We're going to talk about that today. And so the thing we need to know about the Bible is that its formation was more about a process over time than a moment in time. There wasn't just a specific point where some people got together for 6 hours and picked some words and they had the authority to say, that's the Bible. There's a different story. It's a little bit like that, but not quite. I think you'll find it very interesting. Have you ever really thought about where the Bible came from? Or have you just accepted it as true because it's part of your church and part of your faith? It's good to know where it came from. The names and dates of the people who created the Bible or had the meetings that decided which books were going to make it into the Bible and which weren't are not as important as the context and the lifestyle of that age. And so as we learn about that, you may hear a couple of dates and a couple of names, but they're not going to form your faith as much as what was happening during that time and how people lived and how they perceived their leaders. And so one of the things to know is that in ancient times there were lots of Bible-ish books floating around, letters, books, pieces of history, poetry, that people weren't necessarily sure about. They had the character of biblical writing, but they may or may not have been true biblical writing. And so what happened over time is that the people, God's people, the people who had given their hearts to God, who had become Christians, baptized into the faith, and carrying out that faith in their community, some who had even been persecuted for their faith, began to look to their leaders, called bishops. They began to look to the bishops and to councils to basically to ratify what they already knew. And so there was this back and forth process that happened between the people and the leaders, between worshiping communities and councils. And the thing we need to know about the bishops is that they weren't men in pointy hats who were isolated from the rest of the people. They weren't politically motivated people. They didn't get their position because they were motivated by a certain status. Back in that day, they were respected leaders who gained their position of bishop because the people recognized the authenticity of their faith and called them to a place of leadership to lead them and to lead them through the beginnings of the church and through some very times that would test faith. And so the bishops would have been more like respected leaders of the church today. Maybe a Billy Graham, a Mother Teresa, a Rick Warren, maybe a Bill Hybels or a Timothy Keller, Craig Groeschel, folks like that, who folks would look to as authentic in their faith and capable of speaking into it. And then the councils also had a certain character. The councils were more like leadership summits. They weren't just, it wasn't like a board meeting where a group of people got together and they said, okay, would anyone pass that motion? Anybody second it? All approve, say aye. All disapprove, say nay. That wasn't it. A council was a summit of leaders that came together to solve a certain issue. And there were many issues of that day. In our case, we're looking at the issue of which books belonged in the Bible and which ones didn't. And so some councils would happen over a period of days, maybe even a week, and some would happen over a period of days that were separated by a week or a month, where they meet one day here and then a week later meet a day and then 2 weeks later meet a day, because they would have some questions and do some homework and come back and continue their discussion. And so as we look at the story of how we got the Bible, the further that Christians got from Jesus, the more urgency there was to create what we call a closed canon. And so the further from Jesus equals more urgency. And when we think about a canon, what a canon is it's a standard of something. A canon isn't necessarily an exhaustive catalog of everything that there was and is and will ever be. But a canon is the standard of something. So, for example, a few years ago, I don't know if you remember, but iTunes released an exhaustive collection of every song that U2 had ever played. And they even uncovered some stuff that hadn't been released before. And you could buy this exhaustive collection and put it on your iPod. I don't know, it was $150 or something. And that would be an exhaustive collection. But a canon of U2 music might be, the top 20 or 30 or maybe 40 songs that represented an authoritative example of what U2's music was all about. Well, that's what our Bible is. It is an authoritative representation telling the story of God as God related to his people and the story of Jesus. And so we'll move forward with that thought. But there became a need for a closed canon. And a closed canon is something that is not to be added to and not to be subtracted from. And in this case, our closed canon, as we discussed last week, was a collection of history and poetry and gospel and prophetic literature and wisdom literature and apocalyptic literature. And so it shares lots of different perspectives about who God is and how he relates to us, his people. But moving forward, as we would discuss that, we look at the Old Testament canon and the New Testament canon, because that's how the Bible's divided. And we don't know as much about how the Old Testament was developed as we do the New Testament, but we find a list of books for the Old Testament as early as AD 70. But it wasn't, no formal listing happened until a guy named Melito of Sardis. And I believe you probably would have said this more like Melito, Melito of Sardis. But it was actually 100 years later in 170 AD where we found the first formal list that pretty much lines up with what we have as the Old Testament today. But we don't really have a formal, accepted, standardized Old Testament until the translation of the Latin Vulgate, where the books of the Old Testament were translated into Latin by the Catholic Church. And that's where it comes from. In fact, it would have been a foreign thought to people in the early church that you couldn't add to or subtract books, because they didn't have this idea of canon or this idea of Bible. They just had this idea of sacred writing. So the only portion of the Bible that they actually thought was canonical would have been the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. Those are only books that you couldn't take from or add to. But as time went on, again, the further we got from Jesus, there became more of an urgency for a closed canon. And so the development of the Old Testament happened pretty quickly and didn't have as many modern or contemporary writings to debate about as the New Testament did. The New Testament takes a little bit different story, and we know a little bit more about it. Now, think about what was happening back in that day. There was a new church. It existed in a world that had escaped persecution, that had found sort of a national home outside of Israel. And there were people who were worshiping together in churches, and they wanted to find a foundation for their faith, and they wanted something to carry with them for all time. And so over time, over a period of dozens of decades, over a period that long, the people would look to their leaders, their bishops, to come up with lists of books. And every bishop had a different list. And so one bishop might say, well, I think the books that are valuable for worship and for ministry are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts, and Romans. that was their favorite books. And it was almost like, if you go to iTunes or Spotify, or I'm not sure, maybe Pandora, but celebrities sometimes post lists of songs that are their favorite. We're like, my favorite athlete listens to these 10 songs before they play the big game. And so we pay attention to those lists, and they sort of inform our taste in music sometimes. Well, these bishops were a lot like this. It was a list of biblical books. Well, every bishop had a little bit different list. Some of them had the same list, but every bishop had a little bit different list. And so what happened over time is that the more bishops who had the same books on the same list, those books became more and more accepted, and they became to be seen as authentic and true, and they were used in the worshiping community of faith. And then things sort of hit a breaking point when one of the bishops, his name was Eusebius. That's a great name, isn't it? I dare you to name your child that. But he was Eusebius. He was a bishop of Caesarea, and he was known as a father of church history. And one of the reasons he was known as a father of church history is because he had access. There was no Google back in that day. He had access to a massive collection of books in the libraries of Caesarea and also in Jerusalem. And he was the first bishop who, instead of applied sort of a general intuition or feel to his list, he applied some strategic kind of research to the list of books that he presented. And instead of general appeal, he looked at them from more of a scientific kind of way. And so he came up with 4 categories for the books that he looked at. And that was recognized as part of the canon, disputed, rejected, or heretical. And now, if they were recognized, it's because they're closely related to the life of Jesus. And there would have been eyewitnesses' accounts that there was an authentic use and there was acceptance among the church. And those books were actually probably the easiest to recognize. It was Matthew and Mark and Luke and John and the book of Acts and the epistles of Paul, the letters of Paul and the letters of John and books like that. And then there were the disputed books. And they were disputed because they were not universally accepted. They were on every bishop's list. And also because the books tended not to maybe articulate the faith as well as some of the other books did. And because the authorship may have been questioned. And the authorship was very important. And so some of those books, for example, would be James. And also the second letter of Peter would just be examples of those who were disputed. It's sort of like, I'm not sure, but we know now that they made it in anyway. And then there were rejected books, and they were rejected because of a lack of clarity or articulation on the part of the book, because of an uncertainty about authorship, and mostly just because in the life of the living church community, they just felt dead. They didn't feel like they informed it or encouraged it or inspired it. And so you don't know the names of these books because they didn't make it into the Bible. But there were the Acts of Paul. There was one called The Shepherd, one called the Apocalypse of Peter, or the Letter of Barnabas. And they weren't even sure if Barnabas wrote the letter to Barnabas, so it didn't make it. And then the last were heretical. And they were heretical because they were most likely not written by the people who are in the title of the book. And also because they were most likely written by false teachers who were looking to gain influence instead of authentic leaders who were looking to lead people closer to God. And so the names of those books would have been the Gospels of Peter or the Acts of Andrew. And, that may be probably the first time you've ever heard that name because they're not in the Bible. Eusebius was the first one really to apply standards outside of a general feel for the Bible. And then the Council of Carthage came together in 397 AD and brought a lot of that same thinking, sort of a standard or a filter as to which books belonged in the New Testament. And it was at that council that we first recognized what we now have as our New Testament. And I got to say this, that even when that council ended, they weren't 100% sure that this was the New Testament, but they felt like they came up with a very good standard of spiritual literature that could be used to help us relate with God. And so it wasn't until years after the Council of Carthage we said yes, until it was approved and confirmed. But their criteria were roughly these 4 criteria. The first criteria would have been the authority of the author. And the closer that author was to Jesus, the more authority they had. And that makes sense, right? And they were recognized for their leadership and for their relationship with Jesus. And so the second criteria was just the message. It was read the message, and what is the message? Does it have life? Does it encourage the church? Does the message inspire? Do you sense the presence of the Holy Spirit in that message? And so that would have been the second criteria. The third criteria was related to the list of the bishops, and so they looked at the books, and the books that had the widest circles of influence, in other words, which were on the playlist of the most bishops, the books which had the widest circles of influence at the earliest dates were the most highly considered. And that makes sense as well. And then the fourth criteria was this: was God's Spirit present in the books as they were used in the church in the context of worship and in ministry? Could you preach from them? Could you quote them? And they instructed faith. And so those were the four criteria. And we'll never know exactly every thought that went into the formation of our Bible. But we know in general the context and the lifestyle that brought it about. And it's a blessing to me. And I got to ask the question in this whole, how we got the Bible. Where's God? Where's God in this process? How does it inform my faith? And just to speak into that a little bit, it gives me comfort to know that the Bible I read was created over time in the context, in many ways, of the same kind of ministry we carry on today. That people had real relationships with God, and they were seeking to find a foundation for the faith that they lived and carried out, and that was tested in the context of real life. And they looked to their leaders to ratify what they already knew from experience. And so that gives me faith much more than if the Bible had just come from one source, sort of a mystical, hey, a guy went in a back room and a mystic spirit controlled his mind and pushed his pencil on the paper and he came out with the holy words. That makes much less sense to me than the context in which the Bible was written, because that context still exists today. And also, I just, if God's going to reveal himself, then why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't he reveal himself through people? Because that's the way he does it. I mean, we'll start with, Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and Abraham and Joseph and Moses and King David and Jesus. God became a person. Why wouldn't he do his work through people like he always does, and like he still does today, and like he wants to do through you? I hope this discussion informs your faith, and I hope the discussion you're about to have continues to inform your faith.